Welcome back to our video blog. This time we will be discussing psychedelics, as we have done before, with particular emphasis on the history, namely the last 100 years. And we begin in the year 2012 and wind up in the year 2018. It's a 100-year history, and it's quite amazing what happened in these 100 years. The history of neuroscience in its entirety is really reflected in the evolution of our understanding of psychedelic drugs. So in the next slide, you can see that Merck Pharmaceutical Company synthesized MDMA in the year 2012. What happened afterwards? Well, nothing happened. The compound sat on the shelf for many, many years. It shared the fate of lithium, which was also discovered many years before it finally entered the clinical arena. The first documented use of MDMA was with the US military in the 1950s, but it was only used on animals and in classified studies that were not really available for public review. It then appeared on the streets of Chicago in 1970, where tablets containing MDMA were confiscated, but the drug began to seep into the culture as at large in the early 1970s. Appears on the scene a person by the name of Alexander Shulgin, who took MDMA himself in ever-increasing doses in his laboratory. And in the notes he wrote, I felt absolutely clean inside, and there was nothing but pure euphoria. I've never felt so great or so believed that this is possible. The cleanliness, purity, and marvelous feeling of solid inner strength continued throughout the rest of the day and evening. I'm overcome by the profundity of the experience. So this gives you a first glimpse as to the power of these drugs. Now, it had to wait until the year 2011 when Michael Mithoefer completed an FDA and DEA approved trial of MDMA in the treatment of severe PTSD with stunning results. 10 out of 12 patients were so improved that they no longer met the criteria for PTSD. Further work, of course, is ongoing, and efforts are afoot to eventually, perhaps in the year 2020 or thereafter, have MDMA be approved by the FDA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder and perhaps other disorder in the future as well. So going back in time, we are now in the year 1938. Albert Hoffman, a chemist with Sandoz in Basel, Switzerland, was synthesizing a number of compounds. He was not pursuing psychedelic compounds, but rather a whole different avenue of psychopharmacology, but he made a compound called LSD, which was sitting on the shelf, and something happened in the year 1943 when he accidentally consumed some LSD. And he writes, the first planned LSD experiment was therefore so deeply moving and alarming, because everyday reality and the ego experiencing it, which I had until then considered to be the only reality, dissolved, and unfamiliar ego experienced another unfamiliar reality. The first time that Albert Hoffman noticed something was wrong was when he was riding his bicycle from the lab to his home and had some strange sensory experiences. He may have touched some LSD on his hands, which may have entered his bloodstream. He then built on this experiment and ingested LSD at a dose of 250 micrograms, a quite heroic dose. Now, he didn't know any better because nobody else had ever ingested LSD in the history of the universe. So that's the beginning of LSD. The next step in the evolution of psychedelics occurred in 1957 when Gordon Wasson, who was a public relations executive at J.P. Morgan with a deep interest in healers in South America, went to a trip to Guatemala and Mexico, and wrote up his experiences in Life magazine in June 10, 1957. Here's a picture in the slide of J.P. Morgan. Of Gordon Wesson, who worked for J.P. Morgan. And in the next slide, you see a curandera. Wesson is taking mushrooms he's receiving from this woman who is handing it to him, named Eva Mendes. In the right background, you see Guy Strassapian, a French anthropologist who accompanied Wesson on this trip. And he began then to chew the mushroom containing the psychedelic psilocybin. Here you see him taking the mushroom from a cup that was given to him by the curandera as she was praying at the household altar. He chewed them slowly, as is the custom, and his sixth pair took him about half an hour to consume. Here you see the curandera, Ms. Eva Mendes, sitting in her meditative posture. She had consumed more than anybody else who was present that evening, but she stayed calm and dignified, often lyrical in her exhortations, sometimes being impatient that the spirits that she was summoning had not arrived yet. You can see the composure of this woman, very much adopting a meditative stance, as you can see it in Chan Buddhist, Zen Buddhist meditation. Now, psilocybin never really went away, and in 1962, Walter Pahnke, early researcher on psilocybin, did a famous experiment called the Good Friday Experiment. 20 Protestant Harvard Divinity School students were involved in the study. They either received psilocybin or an active placebo named nicotinic acid, which causes flushing of the face and the illusion that one had taken an active compound. This experiment was followed up by Dr. Doblin from 1986 to 1989, who did a follow-up on the Good Friday experiment and identified all but one of the divinity students who had taken part in the original experiment. And he interviewed them. And here's what he heard. He was told that the experience had shaped their lives and work in a profound and enduring way. So we are now up to the year 1962. And in the next slide, you see the first appearance of Timothy Leary, a psychologist at Harvard, who got a hold of LSD, which he promulgated among his students. And this was the time of the early Vietnam War and the protest movement in America. And psychedelic drugs became identified with this movement and in effect became somewhat contaminated with the psychosocial implications of the anti-establishment movement. So Timothy Leary recommended to take LSD and eventually drop out of society and refuse to participate in what he perceived as unconscionable fallout from imperialism and capitalism. And here finally is the appearance of Stanislav Grof, a psychiatrist from Prague, Czechoslovakia, who immigrated to the US in 1967. He was the one who did the first serious experiments and controlled experiments of psilocybin in patients. In particular, he had addressed the need of patients suffering from existential despair and depression and anxiety in the context of a terminal cancer diagnosis. He has written a number of books here in the slide: Realms of Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research, and Consciousness and the Mystery of Death, together with Ben Lomond. You have a reference here of the MAPS Society 2006. MAPS in the last year or so had a big meeting in Oakland, and it's quite amazing how far this group has come in promulgating the use of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry. And the fact that DEA-approved trials are now being conducted are in part due to MAPS efforts. Okay, now, we are now entering the nuclear, almost said nuclear, the psychedelic winter. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, and all psychedelics wound up as Schedule I drugs, indicating that they had no known use in medicine and therefore were banned and could not be prescribed by any physician for any purpose at all. And this state of affairs lasted 30 to 40 years, and no research really was done in the United States during this time. Now, Switzerland, being a more enlightened society, continued experiments with psychedelic drugs and were far ahead compared to the US in their insights as to what these compounds can do. Now, things turned around in the early 2000s. Here is a 2006 study by Roland Griffiths, a senior psychopharmacologist at Johns Hopkins University, who introduced psychedelics in promoting and allowing people to have deep mystical experience in sessions involving psilocybin, and use these also then in the treatment of treatment-resistant depression as well as addictive disease. These studies are still ongoing. It's very interesting to note that Dr. Griffiths is also a dedicated meditator, and he sees strong parallels between the psychedelic experience and the meditative experience. There are a number of YouTube videos that you might watch where Dr. Griffiths, who comes across as a very nice person, explains his experience with these drugs as well as his meditative experience. So what he observed then is that some people experiencing the mystical experience state also report sustained positive changes in personality, in particular in a personality dimension called openness. Now, it was thought until recently that personality dimensions are quite unchangeable and stable over the lifetime. However, it appears that the exposure to psychedelics can change personality dimensions previously thought to be set in stone, particularly increase in openness, which is one of the characteristics thought to be quite unchangeable. Openness, of course, is an incredibly useful personality trait to be able to modify, as it may allow you to enter new experiences and avail yourself of new knowledge as it comes along. So here is Dr. Griffiths saying the core feature of the mystical experience in the strong sense is the interconnectedness of all things, where there's a rising sense not only of self-confidence and clarity, but of communal responsibility, of altruism and social justice, a felt sense of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. And those kinds of sensibilities are at the core of all the world's religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions. So quite a program here and quite a hint as to what he believes psychedelic drugs might be capable of. Now we now switch gears. And as the decades roll by and psilocybin and LSD have come back into research, researchers were busy developing neuroimaging techniques. And here's the first study ever to look at what happens in the brain in terms of brain connectivity in people exposed to psychedelic drugs. This was done in London, at a college in London, and performed by Robin Carthart-Harris as well as Dr. David Nutt, who is the leader of the laboratory. Carthart-Harris is a very prominent researcher now in the psychedelic field. And let us look at a couple of data points here that they generated. Here's the main finding, namely, in opposition to what they had anticipated, namely an increase of metabolic activity in the brain, they found a stunning decrease and a silencing of neuronal systems, of brain circuits identified with the default mode network, which is located in the medial aspects of the brain. This brain area is highly active when we do nothing. We are not engaged in any particular cognitive task. We are just left to our own devices. And usually what this default network will do is focus on self-referential thinking. How did I do? How will I do tomorrow? What's going on? What are my fears, hopes for the future, and regrets for the past? It's kind of an internal laboratory of rehearsing social relationships and anticipating the future and reviewing the past. So this area is silenced by psilocybin in this experiment. Very unusual finding and totally unanticipated by the researcher. Interestingly, in meditative states, the same area is also silenced. We have talked about experiments by Judson Brewer at Yale at the time, who found that experienced meditators were able to shut down the default mode network in the meditative states as well, indicating there might be a parallel between the activity of psilocybin and other psychedelics and meditation. So here is another way of putting this. You can see here the timeline, the blue line indicating that there's a decrease in metabolic activity in the default mode network, which correlates nicely with the intensity of the state experienced by the experimental subject. Now, Carhart Harris and Dr. Nutt have gone further and now applied psilocybin in treatment-resistant depression and have found some positive findings. Namely, there is a subset of patients highly responsive to psilocybin, and here you can see that this positive response in depression correlates with a decreased activity in metabolism in the amygdala, that area that processes usually scary and unsettling emotional experiences. And you can see here another finding whereby an increase in the medial prefrontal cortex connectivity predicts the response at week 5 in patients with severe unremitting depression, indicating that it's network connectivity that is being tapped on into by psychedelic drugs, which heralds the successful resolution of treatment. Now, in the meantime, basic researchers have been busy and have found that they could identify the binding site of LSD to the serotonin receptor. And they can show that the binding is such that it predicts that LSD will stick to this serotonin receptor 5-HT2 for extended periods of time, which may be the corollary of the fact that the LSD experience lasts for hours and hours, much longer than the psilocybin experience usually does. Now finally, as a ringing out of this brief survey, Carhart Harris has gone even further, has teamed up with a mathematician, Selen Atasoy, from Spain, who have developed mathematical models which show that there seems to be a widening of the repertoire of states that the brain can enter under the influence of LSD. Well, we don't have time and space at this point, now this is the year 2017, to analyze this in great detail. However, the summary states that the active repertoire of brain states under LSD closely follows power laws, indicating a reorganization of the dynamics at the edge of criticality. Criticality is a technical term indicating that brain states are designed in such a way that they are close to the edge of chaos, where brain circuitry might go unstable, but it's close to that edge that the brain is most productive, most creative, and most amenable to change. So this was the year 2017, and now we enter the year 2018, One more study here coming out of Switzerland, the laboratory of Dr. Wollenweider with collaborators in Germany. And here shows that 5-HT2A receptor activation by LSD changes the ego boundaries of people involved in a experiment using avatars and artificial environments, indicating that relationships, interpersonal relationships, might change in response to a decrease in ego boundaries produced by psychedelic compounds. So if you step back and look from the year 2012 to the year 2018, you have seen a stunning advance in our understanding of these drugs. And if it hadn't been for the winter of psychedelics from 1970 to the early 2000s, we may have advanced quite a bit further. So the hope then is that these compounds can be utilized in psychiatry to advance our understanding of the brain and be potent therapeutic agents, perhaps in allowing a resetting of crystallized and frozen brain connectivity circuits that lead to depression and other disorders. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you soon again at a talk here at Behavioral Health 2000.